Right now, you're wearing clothes. You didn't think about it this morning. You got dressed the way you get dressed every day, on autopilot, grabbing a shirt because it was clean, or because it matched something, or honestly, because it was just within arm's reach. Nobody asked your permission. Nobody checked. For about 250 years of Japanese history, that sentence alone would have made you a criminal. Walk down a street in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, in the year 1700, and the first thing that should strike you isn't the swords or the wooden rooftops. It's that almost everyone around you is wearing a uniform they didn't choose. Not a soldier's uniform, a legal one. The fabric against their skin, the color on their sleeve, even the pattern dyed into the collar. None of it was their decision. It was the government's. And the thing that decided what you were allowed to put on your own body wasn't your money. It wasn't your taste. It wasn't even really your job. It was something stranger than that, and more controlling, and honestly, more clever than anything you've probably heard about feudal Japan. Here's what most people assume when they picture historical clothing. Rich people wore silk because they could afford it. Poor people wore burlap because they couldn't. Simple economics, dressed up as history. Here's the thing. That's not what was happening in Edo, Japan at all. A merchant in Osaka could be richer than half the samurai in his province and still be legally forbidden from wearing the silk he could easily buy. This wasn't a matter of what you could afford. It was a matter of what you were allowed, full stop. And the law didn't care how full your strongbox was. Second assumption. People imagine feudal Japanese dress as a kind of early fashion scene. Personal style, individual taste, the same impulse that makes you pick an outfit today. It wasn't that either. For most of the population, there was no picking anything. Clothing was a coded uniform, reissued and reinforced by government edict, sometimes down to the specific weave of the cloth. And the third assumption? That these were soft customs, like a modern office dress code, the kind of rule everyone quietly ignores. Also wrong. People were fined for this. Property was confiscated for this. In the worst cases, people were exiled for this. So if it wasn't about money, and it wasn't about taste, and it wasn't a polite suggestion, what was clothing actually doing in Edo, Japan? Turns out, it was running one of the most elaborate experiments in social control in human history. And it started because the government had a very specific problem on its hands. In 1603, after roughly a century and a half of civil war, the Tokugawa shogunate finally locked the country down into peace, which created an awkward new problem. An entire warrior class, the samurai, with nothing left to fight. Peace is great for everyone, except the people whose entire identity is built around war. The solution was to freeze society in place. The government formalized a 4-tier class order known as shi-no-ko-sho: samurai, peasant, artisan, merchant, in that ranked order, and then used law to make sure everyone stayed visibly, permanently inside their assigned tier. Here's the detail that should already feel off. Peasants officially outranked merchants. Not wealth-wise, rank-wise. A starving rice farmer technically stood above the richest trader in Osaka because the ideology prized growing food over moving money. Officially, anyway. That gap between official rank and actual wealth is the entire story. Because peacetime trade was making merchants extraordinarily rich, fast. Richer in many cases than the samurai who were supposed to outrank them. Money was no longer matching status. And a government that can't fix that with money has exactly one other tool. Make status something you can see. Worth saying clearly, the 4-tier system was always more of an ideal than a lived reality. Peasants made up roughly 4 out of every 5 people in the country. Artisans were prized for skilled craft, And the whole ranking borrowed heavily from Confucian values imported from China. Values that honored growing rice over moving money. Full stop, no exceptions, no matter how the math actually worked out in anyone's bank ledger. That's where the kinshide come in, literally prohibition orders. A relentless stream of sumptuary edicts regulating exactly what each class could put on its body. Fabric, color, pattern. In some versions, even umbrella size and the length of a woman's hairpin. Historian Donald Shively, in a landmark 1964 study published in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies, cataloged how often these edicts had to be reissued throughout the Tokugawa period. Over and over, decade after decade, almost like clockwork. And that repetition is the tell. A law you only have to pass once is a law that worked. A law the government keeps re-announcing for 250 years is a law that one specific group of people kept breaking. And breaking it on purpose, because they could finally afford to. Officially, the system never changed for 2.5 centuries. Unofficially, it was being quietly outrun the entire time. Before money even entered the picture, color alone could tell you everything. Certain shades of purple, made from the famously expensive and labor-intensive Gromwell root, had been tied to the highest ranks of Japanese society since long before the Tokugawa era, and the shogunate's sumptuary laws locked specific purples and certain vivid reds firmly out of reach for commoners. Anthropologist Liza Dalby, in her 2001 book Kimono, Fashion Culture, describes color in this period as functioning almost like a uniform badge, readable at a glance, before anyone said a word or you even noticed the cut of the garment. You could be the wealthiest commoner in the entire city of Edo and still, legally, be less purple than a mid-ranking samurai. Honestly, there's something almost sad about that. So merchants did the obvious thing. They got creative. Banned from silk, embroidery, and fine weaves on the outside, they started lining the inside of their plain cotton and hemp robes with extraordinary silk, gold thread, hand-painted scenes, dye work that took master craftsmen months. Invisible most of the time, visible only in a flash, when an arm reached out or a sleeve swung open. Sociologist Eiko Ikegami, in her 2005 book Bonds of Civility, describes this restraint as display as part of a broader Edo aesthetic called iki, sophistication measured by what you chose not to show rather than what you flaunted. Which is, when you think about it, just 17th century flexing with a built-in alibi. Here's a strange little bonus fact while we're on the subject of clothes. The word kimono didn't originally mean this exact garment at all. Ki means to wear. Mono means thing. Kimono just meant the thing you wear. Generic. Almost boring. It only became the proper name for this specific outfit in the late 1800s, after Japan opened to the West and suddenly needed a word to separate it from yofuku, Western clothes. For most of the period we're talking about tonight, there was no kimono. There was just clothes, and an enormous, expensive legal argument about what was allowed to be on them. Forcing the wealth underground didn't kill the competition. It just made it obsessive and arguably more beautiful, because now luxury had to survive being almost entirely hidden. If hiding your silk in a lining felt like too much effort, there was a more direct option, and it sounds almost too simple to be legal. You could buy a different legal identity. A struggling, low-ranking samurai household, and there were plenty since samurai stipends were fixed while prices weren't, could formally adopt the son of a wealthy merchant family in exchange for a substantial payment. On paper, nothing about the boy's blood had changed, but his legal status had. A child born into a class forbidden from wearing fine silk could, with the right amount of money and the right indebted family willing to sign the paperwork, simply become someone the law treated completely differently by morning. Historian David Howell, in his 2005 book Geographies of Identity in 19th Century Japan, argues that Tokugawa status categories were far more negotiable in practice than the tidy four-tier chart suggests. Paperwork, in the end, mattered more than birth. Turns out the easiest way to beat a 250-year sumptuary law wasn't to break it. It was to legally stop being the kind of person the law applied to. Unsurprisingly, the shogunate tried to ban this, too. Another kinshide, reissued, ignored, reissued again. You can probably guess by now how that went. Here's the part of this story that people screenshot. In 1657, Edo suffered one of the most catastrophic urban fires in human history, the Meideki Fire. Over 100,000 people died. Most of the city burned to the ground. According to the most widely repeated account of how it started, retold by textile historian Terry Satsuki Milhaupt in her 2014 book Kimono, A Modern History, a Buddhist temple had agreed to ritually cremate a furisode, a long-sleeved kimono, that had supposedly belonged to 3 different young women in a row, each of whom died of lovesickness for a boy glimpsed wearing the same pattern. The robe, by this point considered cursed, was set alight in the temple courtyard. The wind caught the burning silk. Embers carried into a city built almost entirely out of wood and paper. Whether that's the literal mechanical cause or a folk explanation layered on after the fact, one thing is verified. The disaster permanently reshaped Edo. Streets were widened, fire breaks were mandated, and the clothing and dye trades, already under constant legal scrutiny, found their fabric-related fire regulations tightened even further in the aftermath. A piece of clothing, the exact thing this entire system existed to control, became, in the most famous telling, the spark for the deadliest fire in the city's history. You couldn't write a darker irony if you tried. Before we go any further, do you think strict sumptuary laws like Edo Japan's actually kept the peace by keeping everyone in their lane? Or were they always elite anxiety dressed up as law, doomed the moment someone got rich enough to ignore them? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more ancient Japan stories nobody else is telling, subscribe now. It's free! So, why did ancient Japanese people start wearing clothes? The boring, practical answer goes back thousands of years before any of this. Woven plant fiber and animal hide. Warmth and protection. The same reason every early human society got dressed. That part of the question answers itself in a sentence. But that's never really the question, is it? The real question, the one buried underneath the title, is why clothing in Japan stopped being a personal decision at all and became, for 2.5 centuries, one of the most tightly regulated visual languages a government has ever built. The answer is that clothing stopped being something you wore and became something the state used to make rank legible on every single body, every single day, whether you could afford to break the rule or not. You can still see the shape of that system today, just with the enforcement removed. School uniforms, dress codes for job interviews, the unwritten rule that you don't show up to a funeral in bright colors. Even luxury logos are basically the lining trick running in reverse. Instead of hiding the expensive fabric on the inside, we put the brand name on the outside, loud and legible, because nobody's going to fine us for it anymore. The instinct never disappeared. Only the law did. And here's the part that should feel uncomfortably familiar. The next time you check your outfit twice before a job interview, a first date, or a funeral, that flicker of, does this say the right thing about me, isn't vanity, and it isn't new. You're running almost the exact same calculation a silk-lined merchant in Edo ran 300 years ago, betting on what his clothes would say before he opened his mouth. He just had more to lose if he got it wrong. A fine? Confiscated goods? Sometimes worse. Edo Japan made the rules official, written down, and enforceable. We just like to pretend ours aren't rules at all. So the next time you grab a shirt off the hanger without thinking twice about it, remember, you're casually exercising a freedom that an entire government once built its whole world around denying.